Hello everybody and welcome to this afternoon's webinar about test specifications. This is the first webinar which is hosted by the English Australia Assessment SIG. So thank you very much to the Assessment SIG conveners for organising this session. Today's presenter is Louise FitzGerald, and Louise is a teacher and teacher trainer at the University of New South Wales Global Centre, and she is also an item writer for the Language Testing Research Centre, the LTRC, which is based in the University of Melbourne. Louise also is a master trainer for the Pearson Test of English, so she knows a thing or two about test specifications. Thanks very much for coming to present for us today, Louise.
It's a pleasure. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm delighted to have so many people listening. We're going to start with a little bit of theory today, and then we're going to get on to what's included in test specifications. I was actually going to mention item writer guidelines, and if you've had a look at the abstract, you'll see that I had item writer guidelines down as well. But once I got into planning this session, I found that I had no time at all for item writer guidelines. So there'll probably be another session on those later sometime. But so we'll just have time for test specs and hopefully some questions at the end. People who signed up early have got a notes page. It's got a watermark confidential on it. So I think you are asked to print it off, and that would be a good idea. And that's basically a sheet to take notes on. So as we go through, you'll be able to take notes as I go through. And if you haven't got it, then it will be emailed to you later. Just take notes on something else. But my idea was to have this sheet as a kind of pro forma for if you're going to write test specifications, you'd have, you know, a basic kind of pro forma to use. And the reason it's got confidential, that was a bit confusing to some people, and that's because these documents are always confidential. So they should always have a watermark on them saying they're confidential. The one that you're doing actually isn't confidential, but, you know, it could be a pro forma. Okay, so let's get started. My slides don't seem to want to move. Hang on. No. Yes, okay. So why do we need test specifications? Well, they provide a blueprint for the test. They ensure fairness, validity and reliability, and also face validity. So the test, each test form and each test item looks similar to others in the suite of tests. Test forms, some people might not know what that means. That's a test itself. So it can be a paper form or it can be an electronic form. But that's the test as the students see it. We call that a test form. And we normally call questions items when we're test writing, because a lot of the questions are in fact not questions. Like there could be true, false, not given or something like that, which is not a question. So just to kind of, some of them are questions and some of them aren't, but they're all items. And test specifications allow us to write multiple test forms and engage multiple item writers. It's like baking a cake. We can just kind of bake a cake, but some people can just bake a cake. And the cake might be good or the cake might not be good. But if we want to bake another cake like the cake we baked before, or we want to bake a decent cake, then we need to have a recipe. So I see test specs kind of like a recipe for a test. So a little bit of theory, fairness, validity and reliability. These are huge areas and there could easily be a webinar on just these three things. But today I'll just go into it very superficially. So we must make sure that our tests are fair so that each test taker has an equal opportunity to demonstrate their ability as every other one. So there's not general knowledge involved or something like that. They all need to be valid. So the test needs to measure what it claims to measure and needs to be reliable. So the test measures equally under similar conditions, you know, today, next year, the year after, and similar cohorts. You know, a group from this class or a group from another class or whatever. So that's reliability. We'll try and change this. Oh yeah, okay, it's working now. Okay, so who should write the specs? A test developer can write the specs, or I've had a lot of good experiences with a test item writing team writing specs as a collaborative approach. They can be adjusted as the test is written. So you're writing the test and you've got your specs beside you, and then you think, these specs don't quite work for this, or we need a bit more room to move, or this is too sloppy, or something like that. And so you can reverse engineer your specs. And I think that's a good thing to remember. But changes need to be agreed upon with a test developer. So if it's the item writing team that's developed the specs, then the item writing team should be involved with the reverse engineering. And these must be documented. You can get into enormous trouble with tests if you don't have good version control. There are so many documents, and you know, different people have different documents, that it's really important to have very good version control. And I've just said before, but I'll say again, all these documents need to be kept confidential and secure. And, you know, we can have a group of item writers, you know, spread around a building, and somebody leaves the specifications document on a desk overnight, and, you know, it could be copied. It really, everything needs to be looked after very carefully. And when we're finished with a document, it needs to be shredded, because these are really the keys to the Buick. Okay, so now I'm starting to work from the pro forma that you were sent. Okay, so the pro forma's called test specifications, and you might like to take notes as I go through here. So the first one is test level, and all tests need to be linked to a level, and they can be linked to the CEFR, and they often are linked to the CEFR, or the Global Scale of English, which is the Pearson scale. They can be linked to a test. They can be linked to the PT academic test. Tests are quite commonly linked to an IELTS test level, or a TOEFL test level, or Cambridge, one of their exams, or the ASLPR. Or it could be linked to a level of the course at your own organisation. It could be, you know, the advanced course, or, you know, the upper intermediate 2 course, or whatever it is, but it needs to be linked to a level. Then we look at the stage of course. What kind of, when should this test be delivered? Is it a pre-course test? Is it a placement test? Is it a mid-course test or an end-of-course test? If it's a pre-course, a placement test, what do the test takers need to know to undertake the course? So, okay, we've got our course and we've got our syllabus, and we think, okay, so to let somebody into our course, what do they need to know? That's what should be tested. For a mid-course, what should the test takers be able to do by this part of the course? You know, what have they already done, and what should be tested out of that? Or at the end of course, what have they learned in the whole course, and that's what should be tested. So the purpose of the test, is it a formative test or a summative test? Now, we're really talking about summative testing here. Specs for formative testing aren't as rigorous as they are for summative testing. And then we should see, well, okay, is it an entry or progress or an exit test? What is the purpose of the test? What decisions can be made on the basis of the scores of this test? And what will successful test takers have access to from this test? So that's if you can answer those questions, that covers the purpose of the test. Then all tests, well, not all, but most tests kind of articulate with other tests, and it's good to know and have that documented how this test fits in with all the other tests. So with internal tests in your organisation, so a placement test, and could have practice questions for a end of term test. It could have a mock test. It could have a mid-course test, which fits in before the end of course test. So how do they all fit in together? And then there should be a timetable for the test that the specs are being written for in relation to all those other tests. And that fits in. They all fit in together. And then who are the test takers? What have they done already, and why are they taking the test? Are they taking it to progress somewhere in your organisation, or are they taking it to progress outside your organisation? Or if it's a high stakes test, then it's, you know, to do something completely different and could even be for immigration purposes. So, you know, what are they doing the test for? And of course, what have they studied so far? So have they studied the full course, or have they studied, you know, part of your course? And you'll notice quite a few of these overlap. And that's fine, because when we look at the test specs, we don't read the whole document as, you know, as kind of a book. We don't start at the beginning and go to the end. We just pop into the bits that we need. So if some of these areas overlap, that's quite a good thing. So we don't have to read the whole document all the time. Although I do suggest that new item writers read the whole document before they start writing, but it's something that you kind of keep on your desk when you're writing, and you've got that and you can go and look at it. You also need to include learning objectives. So not all learning objectives can be tested, but the ones that you want to test need to be chosen, and of course those need to be documented. Okay, I was just looking at the can-do statements for the CFR, and I looked at one of them that I thought was really very hard to test in an exam environment. CFR C2 can substitute an equivalent term for a word he, she can't recall so smoothly that it's scarcely noticeable. Well, that would be very hard to test. It could come up in a test, but you need to choose your can-do statements according to what's kind of testable. Not all of them are testable. And so, you know, you have to kind of pick and choose the ones that are important, but also the ones which are testable. And of course, a test is only a sample of language. And, you know, you can't test the whole of a test taker's language. We just test a little bit and we extrapolate from that as to, you know, what their level is. So it's not a problem that we can't test everything, even though maybe these can-do statements are, you know, in our syllabus. Okay, so then we look at the test rationale, right? We look at the decisions that have been made in relation to the test. Okay, so we link the syllabus. What is the link to the syllabus with this test? And what similarities are there and differences are there from the content of the course. So, and why are we not testing the whole content of the course? Or why have we chosen this to test and not that? And maybe because we test that in a different place or at a different time, or we think that it's too difficult to test, so we're not going to do that. And then we need to document how each section fits into the test and then fits into the item bank. Okay, now we look at the delivery of the test. At what point in the course are we going to deliver the test? Are we going to deliver it before the course starts? And if so, how much before? How long before? Can we deliver it the day before the course starts, or a week before, or do we need 2 months before the course starts in order to process the results and do all the admin that need to be done to get the course underway? Or is it a mid-course test or a post-course test? But, you know, how exactly where? If you have a 10-week course, can you do your test on the last day of the course? Well, probably not, because you have to process the scores and do whatever needs to be done. You might have to send the scores to a university or to immigration or something. So you might have to do the test in week 8 or week 9. So all this needs to be documented. Is your test paper-based or digital? Are they going to do it on a tablet, or a laptop, or a PC? There's certainly much more digital testing going on these days. Is it going to be delivered in class or an exam hall or in a computer lab? Is it going to be off-site in their homes? Can they do it at home? Or is it going to be done offshore? You know, all of these have implications for the test. Are test takers going to be doing the test alone, or are they going to be doing it in pairs or groups, which is often popular for speaking tests? And actually getting the students to interact in a speaking test is, you know, really good practice. And is the test going to be recorded? If it's a speaking test particularly, it can be recorded. And if it's going to be recorded, then how are those recordings going to be managed, and how long are they going to be kept, and all that has to be documented as well. It's quite a detailed thing. So next is the format of the test. How many sections are you going to have in your test? You have to look at it, is it a whole test that we're writing specs for, or are we just writing for a skill? So if we're writing for let's say a speaking test only, then, you know, we could have different sections of our speaking test, but we could have a whole test as well. So the first section might be speaking, then we might have listening, then we might have reading, then we might have writing. So you've got to really work out what you need. And then once you've got your sections worked out, how many items are you going to have per section? And then what topics are you going to use per section? And what topics are you going to avoid per section? You might avoid a topic because that's tested elsewhere, or that's dealt with in a different way, not a test, but maybe some other way in your course. And so you don't want to overlap with that topic. Or it might be a topic that you think maybe the first topic in a course, and you think that's a bit inconsequential, it's not really worth testing. And we were just really getting our students to feel comfortable with our course. So, you know, that's not really worth testing. Then we need to document what text types as input material we want to use, and the length of the test types. I'm working with a test at the moment which is incredibly tight. The specs are very tight, and we have to write texts that are between something like 490 and 495 words. But sometimes you want to give more latitude. You know, you can give 20-word latitude, or you might even give maybe 30. Depends on, you know, how tight you feel the test should be. Then, should these texts be authentic? Should they be gathered from journals, gathered from podcasts, gathered from the news, or what media you want them to be gathered from? And if they are going to be authentic, then copyright comes into play, and you have to be very careful to have that managed. Usually that's not managed by the test writing team, it's managed by some other kind of administrative part of the organisation. So quite often, if it's going to be authentic, there'll be a list of areas in the media that you can use that are either copyright free or that you can easily get copyright from, or they might even be media from your own organisation. And then if the scripts are item writer generated, then that's actually less of a worry. They're always, not always, they're very, very often based on an article or something, some kind of media. It's very hard to dream up a topic if you're going to be writing a fairly reasonably long text, just dreaming it up, unless it's a narrative, but usually it's based on something. And you have to just make sure that you don't base it too carefully or too closely on that input text, because if you do, then you're in breach of copyright. And then you'll also document what item types you want to use in the section. So you might say, well, in my first section, we're going to use true, false, not given. And in the second section, we're going to use multiple choice. And in the third section, we're going to use heading bank or something like that. Or you might have even a couple of item types for each section. You have to make your decision how you want to do that. And different text types lend themselves to different item types. So you just have to kind of work those in, see what works best for you. And so for every section that you have for the test, you'll fill out that section area. Okay, so for procedure, how will the test be administered? So how's that going to be organised? Who will run the test? This is out of the hands of the test writing team. Who will invigilate it? Is that going to be the teachers, or is that going to be outside invigilators, or who's organising this? How will the seating be organised? If it's a speaking test, obviously it has to be done in a smaller room, and you might have 2 test takers. You might have an interlocutor and an examiner. How does that all work for seating? Or you might have a hall and you've got to have a minimum of 1.5 meters between every desk. I don't know, but you've got to think about that when you're doing these specs. What do test takers need to take to the test? So do they need a dictionary? Do they need their course book? Do they need pencils, or are you going to supply pencils? What is it that they need, and what can they not have with them? And I think this is much more of a deal these days, when cheating's become such a big issue. And, there are pens that read text, and you have to be careful of exactly, what kind of pen they have. And that's why, there are a lot of tests these days that actually they say, you just come in, no hats, no mobile phones, obviously, no smartwatches, no this. And we're going to supply the pens. So you leave your pencil case and all your pens behind, and you just, you use ours. Another thing you have to think about is when the test papers will be distributed. So are the test papers sitting on the desks when the students arrive to take the test, or is everybody seated and then the test papers are distributed? Clearly, you don't want anyone to start looking at the test paper before the the test starts. So sometimes it's best not to have them sitting out on the test tables. When are you going to distribute the answer sheets? Do you do that with the test papers or not? There's a whole protocol that you'll work out for that. Timing for the test, very important. So what's the total time allowed? Of course, there's always some administration time, handing out the papers, explaining what's needed, introducing them to each part of the test perhaps, or just one explanation for the whole test. Then they may need reading time. Then how long are they going to have for their answering of the items? And then are they going to have time to transfer their answers to an answer sheet? You know, you have to decide how the test is going to be administered, and then all this knocks on from that. And is the time for each section going to be a suggested time or an enforced time? If you say, well, you should take about 20 minutes for the first section and 15 minutes for the second and 30 minutes for the third, but if they don't take that time, you know, is that okay? Or are you going to take away the papers so they have to take that time? You know, you've got to work that out. Okay, and what skills are you going to test? Are you just going to test speaking, listening, reading and writing? Or maybe you want to test vocabulary or maybe grammar or something else. And are these skills going to be discrete? So when we're testing speaking, we're only testing speaking, or are we going to test speaking and listening together? And so have some scores for their listening and scores for their speaking in the same items. Or that's, you know, up to you. And then the sub-skills, what skills were covered in the syllabus? So you might say, well, we really want our students to be very good readers for specific information. So then that's tested. Or we want our students to be really good public speakers because they're going on to university and they have to give presentations. So we're going to test that. That's, you know, what their needs are, I suppose. Then topics. This is another area. Are you going to have one topic throughout the whole test? So we're going to have our test about the environment. So all the items refer to the environment. Or are we going to have several topics? So maybe each section has a different topic. And in that way, we can cover more contexts and we can probably have a broader text, get a bigger sample of the student's ability. And are we going to cover topics in the course or are we going to cover topics that weren't covered in the course, but we think that the test takers should be able to transfer their knowledge from the topics in the course to the new topics in the test? They're all decisions. So with each section, if you're using the handout that was given to you, there's a dark box for the section. So this is where we're looking at the moment. So we look at the number of sections and you'd have to fill out one of these boxes for each section of your test. So we look at how many sections we want, the skills that are tested in each section, the order of the sections. Normally the order is the easier tasks at the beginning and the more difficult tasks at the end. So we ease our test takers into the test and they feel that they're they get a confident start to the test. I think that's really important. What tasks we're including in each section and the total score for each section. So we look at the skills tested, the number of items and the number of texts, number of items per text. You might have one text for one item or you might have one text for 5 items. That's up to you. What are your text types, your text length, the sources for your texts, the item types that go with your texts. You look at the scoring and the weighting of the scores. Then the rubrics. So you've got standard rubrics for every item type, and then an example. And the example is very helpful for the item writers. Then you look at scoring. So what's the total score for the test? And then the total score for each section and for each item. And of course, the total score for each item and section has to add up to the total of the test score. And then you need to see, are we going to weight these items, or all our items and our sections going to have equal weighting? Sometimes the easier items are weighted more lightly than the more difficult items. Whoops. And are we going to have a situation where the test taker can only gain points, or maybe the test taker can lose points as well, depending on your item types? Then we've got to decide on the pass mark. Sometimes you want a pass mark of 50, but you know, your pass mark could be 60 as well, depending on what your test takers need to do with their score. And then cut scores need to be decided. This is if you've got a test and your test takers can score maybe A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so what score is the cut score for an A? So maybe A is 80% and above. So 80% is your cut score. And your B is 70 to 79, something like that. So you've got to organise and think about, well, depending on what your students need or your test takers need to do with your test, where do you want to put those cut scores? And then this is an area that's often neglected, but I think is a particularly important part of testing, and that's validation and monitoring. Some tests are never piloted, but if you don't pilot your test, you never know that your test is actually doing what you hope and have, you know, spent all this time writing your test, hoping that and expecting it to do. So I strongly advise that all tests are piloted, but you've got to decide how is it going to be piloted and when is it going to be piloted. So what population is it going to be piloted on? This is quite difficult because you've got to find a similar population to your test-taking population. So you're writing a new test and you've got maybe your students coming through. So could you pilot your test on the last cohort from the old test, perhaps? But you've got to make sure that they haven't learnt much more English since they were tested or since they left your organisation or whatever, and getting them back again can be difficult. And of course, when you're piloting a test, you have to be careful that the test isn't leaked. So you've got to kind of play that game quite carefully. And how will the test be validated? Will there be statistical analysis done on your test? And if so, are you going to hire psychometricians to do that? If it's a high stakes test or it's a test in an organisation that has psychometricians, then, you know, that's something you can do. But if it's, you know, not such an important test, probably won't. But then there needs to be, once you've done this validation and monitoring, modifications will have to be made to the specifications, to the test design, and to the tests and items themselves. So time needs to be given to do this before the test goes live. But sometimes this is actually done while the test is live, if it's not piloted. And then the test or the item bank has to be organised. So you have a test bank to allow for multiple test forms, and you rotate these test forms so you're not using the same test all the time, and you know, because obviously the test takers would become aware of the contents. So you could have a section bank and rotate the sections. So instead of rotating the whole test, you're rotating parts of the test. So you're kind of mixing and matching your sections. Or you could have an item bank, and that's the best way because you're mixing and matching all your items. So that really frustrates test taker cheating. So how do you organise and manage the test bank or the item bank? How many test forms are you going to have, or how many sections or items are going to be in the bank? And then, of course, the time that you are allocating for writing the test needs to be adjusted as to, you know, how big your bank is going to be and how you're going to manage your bank. But if you have an item bank rather than a test form bank, you can have fewer items. And of course, there are many documents that go with the test specifications. It's not a standalone document, it's part of a whole suite of documents. So probably the next most important document is the item writer guidelines. And these are item-specific guidelines which are used by the item writers for every item that they're writing. So if they're writing section 1, true, false, not given items, they've got the specifications for those true, false, not givens next to them while they're writing. And this ensures that you have a standardised test. This is a really big thing, and I think there'll probably be a webinar just on that. And interestingly, in my experience up until recently, item writer guidelines could be either 1 page or they could be 5 or 6 pages, but I'm now writing a test that there's an item with 55 pages of item writer guidelines. So they can be extremely detailed, but they don't have to be. You might want a vocabulary list. So the vocabulary from the list can be used in your test, but vocabulary that's not on the list wouldn't be used. That could be an academic word list, or it can be vocabulary from a textbook that's being used. There should be a document for rules for using images if you've got images in your test, because there's copyright on images. Also for style of images, what kind of style are you looking for in your test? Then overlap spreadsheets. So you have a spreadsheet that shows the item writers that they're not testing the same thing twice in the same test. Rating scales, of course, need to be written, so the markers know how you want your test to be rated. Taboo topics, there's a fairly long list. It's pretty general, but you don't have texts which talk about any kind of sinister thing, and also texts can't be on examinations because that's stressful, or common phobias, things like that. You never put spiders into a text in case the test taker might be phobic to spiders and then can't go on with the test. You need documentation for the test or the item bank, as I said before. What does the score report for your test takers look like? How are you going to design your score report? You need a test day guide for the administrators of the test, so everybody knows what they're doing on the test day and how they handle the test. You need to have training and a marking guide for the objective markers. What's accepted? Is only correct spelling accepted, or are there acceptable spelling mistakes or not? That's one thing that would go into the marking guide. The outline for the method of moderation and rate of standardisation for speaking and writing assessments. And should that be face-to-face or remote? I read some recent research to say that remote standardisation seems to be just as good as face-to-face. So you may not have to hold a meeting. You could do that remotely. And then, of course, the security documentation. The documentation which says where the test is scored, who has access to the test, who has access to the test bank, how the security on the computers, where the item writers are working, all that stuff needs to be done. And, what happens to the test forms once they've been used, et cetera, et cetera. So that also needs to be documented. Right, so that's the end of my webinar on test specs, but I wanted to draw your attention to the LTRC. Now that we've finished the webinar, you have access to this resource, which is hosted on the English Australia webinar, to log in your professional development, and you can get points for your professional development as well. So if you log in here, you can keep a portfolio of your PD, including this and any other PD you do, which has been registered with English Australia. I think this is a wonderful resource because, sometimes for your CV, or when, you go to an interview, you could bring along a copy of this register and showing all the PD that you've done at the moment, or just for your own organisation, or just for your own benefit. So I really recommend that you register for this and all other PD that you do. Okay, well, thanks very much. We've got 2 minutes left for some questions. Sophia, I don't know if you want to take a question or two?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, could you just type them into the question box? So the questions will just take a minute or two to come through, Louise.
Yeah, it's fine.
So yeah, thanks also for going through the Elta. Just for all the attendees today, we'll be sending out some statements of attendance for this webinar early next week. And as Louise said, if you register on the Elta, this session will automatically be updated on your CPD record for you. All right, some questions have come through.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Louise, did you have a question?
How many points do they get for this webinar, Sophie?
Yeah, great. It's if you come to the live webinar sessions, they're 2 points, 2 CPD points per webinar.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, there's a question. Do you have any suggestions for setting cut scores?
Wow. Yes, I suppose I think what you should do really is, once you've piloted your test and you know how the test is working, then I'd talk to my colleagues who are teaching on the test, excuse me, on the course, and really go through and look at the marks and, excuse me, and look at the scores that the test takers have, and I'd have a discussion. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. A discussion with people who know the course and know the test and know the test takers. So in the pilot, I think.
Okay, sure. Someone has said, can you tell us more about the remote standardization study you mentioned?
It's in the references. Are the references on the next slide? Let me just go.
They are, yep.
They are, okay. It's this one, this middle one, Rakes, Fiddler and Gill. So that's the one. If you read that, you'll know all about it.
Wonderful. Okay. Sorry, there are a few more questions. Yep.
Just try and, I don't know if we need to leave that on. Yep. Okay.
Okay, going back to the beginning of the test specs, To what extent is it okay to rely on scales such as CFR or GSE as the starting point of the specs? Should we be going deeper into theories of language constructs?
Look, yes, I think the answer is yes, but I could have spent a lot of time going into the theory, etc. But this I only had 45 minutes, so just going across. I think the more you know about testing, the better. And looking at the research is often, it's obviously a better way to do it. But you can do it on the CFR and you can do it on the GSE. It's how you want to do it and what resources you have in your organisation. If you've got testing specialists, that's fabulous. But if you haven't, you might have to rely on something which is kind of maybe less rigorous, but still can work. There's no reason why it can't work.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can you give an example of item writer guidelines for a listening or a reading test?
Okay, well, I can. So the item writer guidelines would have, so let's say we've got a multiple choice listening. So in the item writer guidelines, it would give you the length of the stem. So maybe your stem had to be between 10 and 15 words, or maybe that's even too long, maybe between 8 and 12 words. And your options need to be in alphabetical order, or they need to be in length of word order, or your options can only have a single word, or your options can have up to 5 words or something like that. That's the depth that you go into with the item writer guidelines.
All right.
Is that clear?
Yeah, I think it was clear for me.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, good.
Another question. How do you know if the test is at a level that you expect? Is there a simple calculation that we can do in relation to the percent of passes and fails or anything like that?
Well, it needs to be piloted because you never really know how a test is working if it hasn't been piloted. Because we can write items that we think are really quite difficult, but we're native speakers, so we think, okay, so this has got maybe C1 vocabulary, so this is a C1 item. But when it's piloted, we find that B1 students can be successful on that. They can get it correct. Or we can say, okay, well, we think this is a C1 item, and then we find our best students get it wrong and our weakest students get it right. So, we don't know until it's been piloted. And then once it's been piloted, it has to go through and be checked. And that's a whole new kind of separate area of how you go through every test taker's scores. Each item, did they get it correct or incorrect? And if they got it incorrect, what option did they choose, or what did they put in, what was wrong, and so what's happening with that item. But that's really very detailed. I haven't really got time to go in. And there's kind of not a quick and dirty way that I know to do it. I don't know. Laura's with me and she's nodding. She doesn't know of a quick and dirty way either. So no, you have to do the work, I think.
Yeah. There's another question that's related. That someone's asked if you know of any good websites or resources for learning basic statistical analysis of test results for the purposes of validation.
I'm looking at Hora here. I don't. Hora, do you know of any? No.
We can maybe have a think about it, and if you do think of any, I can send it out with the email tomorrow that goes out to people if something springs to mind.
Yes, I can contact somebody I know who's in that area. If you can send me that question, Sophie,
sure,
and I'll send it through. Yeah, is that okay?
Wonderful. Yep, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll see if I can find an answer, but yeah.
All right.
I may be able to. It's not really my area.
Thanks very much. And the last question, what are your thoughts around scaling test results?
Well, yeah, test results are often scaled. I suppose in a perfect world we wouldn't have to, but it's not a perfect world. So, look, I think it happens all the time. Yeah. Well, maybe not all the time, but it happens frequently. Yeah, it happens frequently. I think, as I said, if it was a perfect test, you wouldn't have to scale it. But, tests aren't perfect. And that's why, I was talking about reverse engineering the specs. I mean, you realise when the test's going, and all of a sudden you might have run the test 3 or 4 times, and then all of a sudden it occurs to you that something's happening in the test, and then you have to go back and re-engineer it. Well, you might want to scale that test because, it wasn't re-engineered properly or wasn't written properly. So, I mean, these documents are kind of, you never kind of finish it and say, okay, that is my document. There are my specs, and these will never be touched again. And, for all of these documents, you add to them as you go, because you learn more and more about the test as it's being run. So the first time you obviously learn the most, and then you go back and you could spend quite a lot of time on your specs and your item writer guidelines. But, and so these are all kind of works in progress. It would be wonderful to have a perfect test, but I don't think it's possible. You could also spend your whole life writing the perfect test. And in the end, you've just got to say, well, this is good. This item works, and then, let it be piloted and checked and let it go. In the end, you don't lose sleep over these things. You just have to do it to your best of your ability, and then let it out and see what happens, and then deal with it, once you've got some data from the test, once it's been piloted, and run. Once it's been live for a while, you'll still be working at it.
Okay, thank you. I've just shared a resource with everybody from Daniel. Thanks, Daniel, for sharing that, about a recommendation from a book from someone in the audience about statistical analysis. So really Green's.
Thank you.
So thanks for that. All right, well, it is probably time to finish up. We've still got a few questions. I don't know if you have to rush off, Louise, or if you can answer a few more.
No, I can answer a few more.
Okay, great. If other people have to head off, that's fine as well. Somebody's asking about test day guides and test rules for test takers. They've said that they've recently found that to be very important. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Very important. And the more detailed they are, the smoother your test day will go. So, I think, really detailed documentation is good. And I think, once you've run your test for the first time, then get together with the group of people who ran it and say, okay, well, what more do you need, and what did you find, and how can we adjust them? I think with all of these things, they need adjusting. And the more people who can be involved, the better it will be for the second time. It's very hard to think of everything the first time round, but, it's good to communicate with the people who are using the test.
All right, and the last question, what's your opinion on having practice tests before the actual exam? Are they essential?
Well, I think practice tests are very good. Look, it depends. If this exam has been taken, like a similar format exam has been taken by the test takers before, so they've actually had experience of the test before, then they're less essential. But I think experience in having taken a similar test really helps on the test day. It helps for test takers' confidence. It helps for them not wasting time getting their heads around what's needed in this item type. If it's a new item type for them, then it's very difficult. And you're not actually necessarily testing their language skills, you're testing their ability to negotiate the item, which you don't want to do, because that will skew your results. So they need to be familiar with the item types. So a practice test is a good way to do that, but don't do the practice test too close to the test, because if it's very close to the test takers haven't got time to assimilate the information and the knowledge they've gained. And, you know, they might find, oh my God, I can't do true, false, not given. You know, I'm really hopeless at this. They need time to go and practice more and get ready for the test. So, you know, give them a decent amount of time between the practice test and the live test. I think is really important.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again, Louise, for sharing all of that expertise with us and information. It was really, really useful. I just want to also introduce Cara Deneen, who's the convener of the assessment SIG. She's just going to tell everyone a little bit about some upcoming events for the assessment SIG as well that people might be interested in.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Sophie, and thanks very much, Louise. There's a lot in there, and I got a lot out of that myself as well. Just to let people know, we have there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot we need to cover when we're trying to look at assessment. So we have some events planned, and I'm aware that not all of you can make it to those events because they involve travel and sometimes expense to the company. But we do have the symposium, the assessment symposium in Brisbane. That's on the 13th of July, and there'll be a series of assessment topics covered there. And we do have planned to record, if technology is working with us on the day, to record some of those sessions and make them available for you via this platform. On the 14th of July, there is an actual item writing workshop, two, in fact, a morning and an afternoon one. So those of you who can do that probably have already signed on because numbers were sort of limited on that. But certainly item writing is an area that people have indicated they want to do some work on. So we will look at how we can work with that on a platform like this. I don't know how straightforward that will be, but we will certainly give it some thought. So that's in July, and then in September we have that's for the English Australia conference, the pre-conference workshops that happen on the September the 18th. It's the Wednesday. We have a workshop on writing rating descriptors. So for writing and speaking assessment, for example. And Uta Noch is going to work with us on that from the LTRC. So, and that's also obviously a really important one. And it's not a quick webinar, that one, but we will certainly look at what we do there and consider ways that we can disseminate this information out for people who can't make it to those events. So keep in touch with us and let us know what's on your mind and what's important and what you specifically would like to see, and we'll work towards finding the way to deliver that. And that's it from me. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Cara. That sounds like a great program coming up. All right, well, thank you again, Louise, and thank you to all our attendees for coming today. We'll be emailing you tomorrow with the handout and some details about the statement of attendance in the Elta as well. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Okay.